Return Engagements is the setup episode for the spin-off Knots Landing, and as such, feels like an intermission in Dallas's third season. But we do get the welcome return of ne'er-do-well Gary Ewing, and he finally makes good. Miss Ellie is melancholy as she looks through some of Gary's childhood things. Outside, the family discusses Gary in absentia on his birthday. Lucy is feisty, Bobby is sad. JR is irritated by the attention that Gary gets. Bobby and JR nearly come to blows, but Jock puts an end to all the foolishness.
You need to learn some manners.
Now, wait a minute. Don't teach me manners, boy.
All right.
Ellie wants Gary back, but Jock tells her that he's just not strong enough to live amongst the Ewings. Ellie is ecstatic when Lucy tells her that she's been sneaking off to meet Valene, though. JR preps to go on a business trip with Kristin, as his secretary, of course, and anyone who thinks otherwise has a filthy mind.
Only filthy minds would come to that kind of conclusion.
Well, there is no shortage of filthy minds here in Dallas.
Sue Ellen promises just as much discretion as JR has shown her. Ellie ambushes Valene and Lucy and begs for Valene to put her in touch with Gary. She admits that she and Gary have a different kind of bond than she has with her other sons.
But I need to have Gary somewhere in my life.
Valene makes no promises, but says she'll see what she can do. Sue Ellen receives a call from Rudy Millington, Kristin's on-again, off-again boyfriend, whom she fiendishly tells to show up and surprise Kristin at the hotel where she and JR are staying. Valene runs home to Gary, having lied to Miss Ellie about how much they're in contact. But Valene is also shocked to find that Gary is clearing out of their apartment for a job offer in California. She implores him to stay and figure things out in Dallas, but he says he just can't stay here. Oddly, he does show up at Ewing Oil to surprise Bobby. Bobby, of course, immediately calls Ellie, and a secret reunion is scheduled.
Well, I have somebody here who wants to talk to you. Hello, Mama.
Gary?
Sue Ellen overhears the big secret plan, though. At the hotel where JR has promised Kristin that there will be no business on their business trip, JR and Kristin run into eccentric superbillionaire Eugene Bullock and his wife Sally for some business. Bullock's open disdain for JR is one of the most entertaining parts of this episode.
Eugene, what on earth brings you here, you sack for sore eyes? Hello, Ewing.
Sally openly says that she's just into Bullock for the money, which Bullock is just fine with. JR casually pitches the idea of using Bullock refineries for all that new crude the Asian oil wells will be producing. Bullock tells his wife to seal the deal, which prompts JR to get rid of Kristin as well. Rudy catches up with Kristin and offers to rekindle their romance in spite of her open gold digging.
What's it worth?
$200,000 a year.
Honey, JR tips $200,000 a year.
Kristin's lust for power is on full display here, but so is her vindictiveness. Both things that would ultimately be her downfall a year later.
I'm at the St. Francis Motel.
Wouldn't they let you in here?
Apparently, you have to make a reservation sometime in advance.
Not if you're important, Rudy.
Miss Ellie and Gary are reunited in a sweet moment. Ellie gives him the pep talk he always needed, that it's important to be able to try at things and fail at them. She also recognizes that failure isn't an option for Ewing men.
No one wants you to be perfect, Gary. Which is what you always had to be.
This prompts Gary to bite the bullet and ask Valene to remarry him.
Valene Ewing. Will you marry me?
Bobby offers to take Ellie to lunch and then shopping for wedding gifts, but when he mentions new houses he's flipping with his construction business, she has a light bulb moment. Kristin has enough of getting blown off by JR and runs over to Rudy's hotel room for a reunion of her own. Bobby tells Jock about the wedding over Ellie's objections. Jock says he won't go because Gary is too weak and will just flake out again anyway. Nice to see that Jock has learned from his mistakes with JR after the Asian oil well fiasco.
I trained JR, taught him everything he knows. Gave him the fever for big business, but I never taught him when to stop.
I think you should be there.
No, Bobby. He's had enough chances. Be the same old story. He'd run away.
When we're together, even the cold of December feels like the middle of May.
JR calls the ranch and Sue Ellen tells him about Gary and Valene. So JR cuts his trip short to run back to Dallas, but Kristin has run off with the car. JR chases Kristin down to retrieve her, but more importantly, the car. And, to add insult to injury, for no reason he has Rudy blacklisted in Dallas.
Do you have a young man named Rudolph Millington working for you? Well, I hate to be the one to tell you, but he's got no character at all. You know, your clients just might be fleeing like lemmings. The Ewing Oil Company may be fleeing like lemmings, too.
Kristin admits that this is the JR she wants to be with. Miss Ellie reveals in a big moment of television history that she's buying Gary and Valene a home in a little cul-de-sac named Knots Landing. Jock swallows his pride and does show up, not exactly reconciling with Gary, but acknowledging him. And that's enough for now.
I have a son getting married here today. I'd like to attend the ceremony, if I'm welcome.
JR arrives, but not in time to break up the wedding. Instead, he's ecstatic to learn that Gary and Valene will be relocating to California and out of his life for good. And we're out! I'm a sucker for the Gary-Ellie relationship. It's one of the purest and most wholesome relationships on the show, and whenever Barbara Bel Geddes gets to exclaim, "Gary!" it's a good day to be alive. Narratively, the episode doesn't fit in well with the rest of the season. JR's refinery negotiation will be revisited later, and I suppose Rudy Mellington can be added to the list of suspects for the cliffhanger. Otherwise, we're just stopping wholesale for what is essentially a backdoor pilot for Knots Landing.
Well, tell me again the name of this place.
Knots Landing.
The episode does fit well thematically, though, as son number 1 just set the living room carpet on fire thanks to his need for attention, and now we get the contrast with son number 2, who never even bothered. I don't even need to analyze this one, as Ellie lays it all out in the episode itself. Gary was always strong enough to stand on his own 2 feet, but Jock and JR kept knocking him down schoolboy style because ultimately they're just sadistic bullies. I'm sure they have some internal coping mechanism about how they're just trying to help toughen him up, but he's 37 at this point. They should know that their methods aren't working. Even though Return Engagements doesn't add much to the narrative flow of Dallas this season, it does provide a few tugs at the heartstrings with Ellie's speech and later with Jock showing up hat in hand to see Gary off. And it's hard to ask for more than that in an episode.